Researchers put both the mental athletes and a group of matched control subjects into MRI scanners and asked them to memorize 3-digit numbers, black and white photographs, and people's faces, and magnified image of snowflakes. While their brains were being scanned, McGuire and her team thought it was possible that they might discover anatomical differences in the brains of the memory champs. Evidence of their brains had somehow recognized themselves in the process of all that intensive remembering. But when the researchers reviewed the imaging data, not a single significant structural difference turned up. The brains of the mental athletes appeared to be indistinguishable from those of the control subjects. What's more, on every single test, the general cognitive ability the mental athlete score came back well within the normal range. The memory champs weren't smarter, and they didn't have special brains. When Ed and Lucas told me they were average guys with average memories, they weren't just being modest. But there was one telling difference between the brains of mental athletes and the control subjects. When the researchers looked at which parts of their brains were lighting up on the mental athletes when the mental athletes were memorizing, they found that they were activating entirely different circuitry. According to the functional MRI regions of the brain that were less active in the control subjects seemed to be working in overdrive for the mental athletes. Surprisingly, when the mental athletes were learning new information, they were engaging several regions of the brain known to be involved into specific tasks. Visual memory and spatial navigation, including the same right posterior hippocampal region that the London cabbies had enlarged with their daily wayfinding. At first glance, this wouldn't seem to make any sense. Why would mental athletes be conjuring images in their mind's eye when they were trying to learn 3-digit numbers? Why should they be navigating like London cabbies when they're supposed to be remembering the shape of snowflakes? McGuire and her team asked the mental athletes to describe exactly what was going through their minds as they memorized. The mental athletes recounted a strategy that sounded almost exactly like what S claimed had been happening in his brain. Even though they were not innate synthetists like S, the mental athletes said they were consciously converting the information they were being asked to memorize into images and distributing those images along familiar spatial journeys. Unlike S, they weren't doing this automatically or because it was an inborn talent they nurtured since childhood. Rather, the unexpected patterns of neural activity that McGuire's fMRIs turned up were the result of training and practice. The mental athletes had taught themselves to remember like S. I found myself fascinated by Ed and his quiet friend Lucas, and this formidable-sounding project of theirs to push their memories as hard and as far as they possibly could. And they likewise seemed fascinated with me, a journalist of roughly the same age, who might share their story in some magazine they never heard of, and perhaps jumpstart their careers of mnemonic celebrities. After Ed lectured at the high school, he invited me to follow him and Lucas to a nearby bar, where he met up with an aspiring filmmaker and old board school chum of Ed's who had been trailing them around New York with an 8mm video camera, documenting their every antic adventure, including Lucas' attempt to memorize a deck of playing cards on the 53-second elevator ride to the Empire State Building's observation deck. We wanted to see if the fastest lift in the world was faster than the Austrian speed cars champion Ed Deadpan. It wasn't. After a few drinks, Ed was keen to carry me deeper into the obscure underworld of mental athletic secrets. He offered to introduce me to the rituals of the KL7, a secret society of memorizers that he and Lucas co-founded at the Kuala Lumpur Championships in 2003, and which evidently was not so secret. KL as in Kuala Lumpur? I asked. No, KL as in Night of Learning. And the 7 is because it started with 7 of us. Lucas explained while sipping one of the 3 free beers he had just won by memorizing a deck of cards for the waitress. It's an international society of the development of education. Membership in our society is an extraordinary high honor, it added. Though the club's endowment of more than $1,000 through the languishes in Luke's bank account, Ed conceded that the KL7 has never actually done much of anything, except get drunk together the evening after memory contest, occasionally aided by a sophisticated pressurized keg attachment designed by Lucas that folds up into a suitcase. When I pressed Ed for more information, he offered to demonstrate the society's single cherished ceremony. Just call it a satanic ritual, he said, and then asked Johnny, his documentarian, to set a timer on his wristwatch. We each had exactly 5 minutes to drink 2 beers, kiss 3 women, and memorize 49 random digits. The 49 digits, it's 7 squared. I was surprised to discover that that this actually quite difficult," said Lucas. "He was wearing a shiny charcoal suit and a shinier tie, and had no trouble convincing the waitress, whom he had already won over, to give him 3 pecks on the cheek. Technically, that's unsatisfactory, but well counted," it proclaimed, a, a, a roulette of beer running down his chin. From his pocket, he spilled out a page of printed numbers and tore it into sections. His finger raced across the scrap until it got to the 49th digit, at which point he stood up and sputtered, "Almost done," and then I limped over to a nearby booth where he tried to explain his predicament to 3 silver-haired women, who seemed far too old to be enjoying this loud bar. With time running out, and before they could respond to his plea, he had leaned across the table and planted his lips on each of their sunken, flustered cheeks. Ed returned triumphantly, pumping his fist and soliciting high fives from all of us. He ordered another round for the table. I didn't know quite what to make of Ed. I gradually discovered an aesthete in the true Oscar Wilde sense, more than anyone I'd ever met. He seemed to participate in life as if it were art, and to practice a studied carefreeness. His sense of what is worthy seemed to overlap very little with any conventional sense of what is useful. And if there were 1% that could be said to govern his life, it is that one's highest calling is to engage in rich escapade at every turn. He was a genuine bon vivant, and yet he approached the subject of his PhD research, the relationship between memory and perception, with a rigor and seriousness that suggested he intended to accomplish big things. He was in no conventional sense handsome, and yet later that night I watched him approach a woman in the street, ask for a cigarette, and a few minutes later walk away reciting her phone number. His normal bar trick, he told me, involves shimmying up to a young lady and inviting her to create an arbitrarily long number, and then promising to buy her a bottle of champagne. Should he succeed remembering it, over the course of the evening, Ed regaled me with story after story of his adventures and instructive misadventures, where there was the time he threw his shoeless self through the window of a bar in New Zealand in order to circumvent a bouncer, the time he crashed a supermodel's party in London. It was easier than I was in a wheelchair, and I could do a superior wheelie. The time he crashed a party in the British Embassy in Paris, I noticed the ambassador following my dirty shoes all the way across the room. And how could he forget the 12 hours he spent panhandling for bus fare in downtown Los Angeles? At the time, I may have sounded a note of skepticism about these self-mythologizing stories, but that was only because I didn't yet know Ed well enough to recognize that he very well could have been understanding their outrageousness. A few more drinks into the evening, it dawned on me that I spent the better part of the day with Ed and Lucas, and neither of them had once called me by my name, though I was sure I told it to them when I first introduced myself. Ed had referred to me in front of the waitresses as our journalist friend, and Lucas just hadn't referred to me. These were evasions I knew well. But Ed had assured me earlier in the day that he could memorize the name and phone number of every girl he ever met. I thought that sounded like the kind of impressive skill that was bound to take one far in life. Bill Clinton is supposed to never forget a name, and well, look where that got him. But it occurred to me that now that Ed's could was a bit ambitious, and might have been the same nature as he could count backwards from a million. As in, yeah, if he wanted to, I asked Ed to remember if he remembered my name. Of course, it's Josh. My last name? Shit. Did you tell it to me? Yes. Foer. Josh Foer. You're human after all. Ah, well. I thought you were supposed to have a fancy technique for remembering people's names. In theory, I do, but its utility is inversely proportional to the amount of alcohol I've imbibed. In theory, Ed then explained to me his procedure for making a name memorable, which he had in the competition to memorize the first and last name associated with 95 different photographic headshots in the name and faces event. It was a technique he promised I could use to remember people's names at parties and meetings. The trick is actually deceptively simple, he said. It is always to associate the sound of a person's name with something you can clearly imagine. It's all about creating a vivid image in your mind. that anchors your visual memory to the person's face, to a visual memory connected to the person's name. When you need to reach back and remember the person's name at some later date, the image you created will simply pop back into your head. So, you said your name is Josh Foer. He raised an eyebrow and gave his chin a melodramatic stroke. Well, I'd imagine you joshing me. Where we first met outside the competition hall, and I'd imagine myself breaking into 4 pieces in response. 4. Get it? The little image is more entertaining to me, at least. And your mere name and should stick nicely in the mind. It occurred to me that this kind of manufactured synesthesia. So to understand why this sort of mnemonics trick works, you need to know something about a strange kind of forgetfulness that psychologists have dubbed the Barker paradox. The paradox goes like this. Researchers show 2 people the same photograph of a face and tell one of them that the guy is a baker, and that the other that his last name is Baker. A couple of days later, the researchers show the same 2 guys the same photograph and ask for the accompanying word. The person who was told the man's profession is much more likely to remember it than the person who was given his surname. Why should that be? Same photograph, same word, different amount of remembering. When you hear the man in the photo is Baker, the fact gets embedded in a whole network of ideas about what it means to be a baker. He cooks bread. He wears a big white hat. He smells good when he comes home from work. The name Baker, on the other hand, is tethered only to a memory of the person's face. That link is tenuous, and should it dissolve, the name will float off irretrievably into the netherworld of lost memories. When a word feels like it's stuck on the tip of the tongue, it's likely because we're associating only part of the neural network that contains the idea, but not all of it. But when it comes to the man's profession, there are multiple strings to reel the memory back in. Even if you don't at first remember the man is a baker, perhaps you get some vague sense of readiness about him, or see some association between his face and a big white hat. Or maybe you conjure up a memory of your own neighborhood bakery. There are any number of knots in that tangle of associations that can be traced back to his profession. The secret to success in the face and name event and remembering people's name in the real world is simply to turn Baker into bakers, or Force into Force, or Reagans into ray guns. It's a simple trick, but highly effective. I tried using the technique myself to remember the name of the documentary filmmaker who had been trailing Ed and Lucas around town all week. He introduced himself as Johnny Lones. We call him Pond Lones. Ed interjected, he used to be heavyset in high school. Since my older brother's childhood nickname was Johnny, I closed my eyes and pictured the 2 of them together, arm in arm, gobbling a pound of cake. You know, we could teach you more tricks like that, Ed said. He turned to Lucas and Entley. I'm trying to think if the end of the night we could have him winning the American Championship. Or by the end of the night we could have him win the American Championship. I get the sense that you'd hold the Americans in a rather low esteem, I said. On the contrary, they just haven't had the right coaches, he said, turning back to me. I reckon you could win the championship next year with an hour's practice a day. He looked at Lucas. Don't you think that's right? Lucas nodded. You and Tony Buzan both, I said. Yes, the estimable Tony Buzan. Ed scoffed. Did he try to sell you the nonsense about the brain being a muscle? Yes, he did. Anyone who knows the first thing about respective characteristics of brain and muscle knows how risible that analogy is. It's my first hint of Ed's tortured relationship with Buzan. It was my first hint of Ed's tortured relationship with Buzan. Look, what you really need to do is bring me on as your coach, trainer, and manager, and spiritual yogi. And what would you get into these relationships? I asked. And what would you get out of this relationship? I asked. I'd get pleasure, he responded with a smile. Also, you being a journalist, I wouldn't mind if in the course of your writing about this experience, you managed to give the impression that I would be an excellent person to have tutoring your daughter in the Hamptons at like a squillion quid an hour. I laughed and told Ed that I'd give it some thought. I honestly wasn't that interested in spending an hour a day pawning through playing cards or memorizing pages of random numbers or doing any of the other mental calisthenics that seem to be involved in becoming a mental athlete. I have always embraced my own nerdiness. I was captain of my high school quiz bowl team, and have long worn a watch with calculator functions. But this was a bit much, even for me. And yet I was curious enough about learning where the limit of my memory lay, where the limits of my memory lay, and intrigued enough by Ed to consider his exercise. All the mental athletes I'd met had insisted that anyone was capable of improving his or her memory, that the untapped power of S are inside all of us. I decided I was going to try to find out if that was really true. That night when I got home, there was a short email from Ed waiting in my inbox. So anyway, can I be your coach?